He kōna e purangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
Kia ora, nau mai hara mai ki te ao hurihanga. Hello and welcome to Our Changing World, ko Concannon tēnei. Maybe you've noticed that I've been a bit absent recently. It's because I'm in Ireland, for the first time since the pandemic hit, and I'm catching up with my friends and family. Luckily, not only do I have great colleagues in the RNZ podcast team making new episodes for the show, and friends at the ABC giving us some of their neat content, we also have an amazing back catalogue of hundreds of Our Changing World episodes, many of which were made by the legendary Alison Ballance. And so, I've got something a bit special for you this week. November marks the 75th anniversary of the rediscovery of the Takahē. Back in 1948, it was believed that this big blue flightless bird had gone extinct. But it hadn't. While she was recently passing through Ōtepoti, I got a chance to sit down with former Our Changing World producer and presenter, natural history book author, and absolute lover of birds, the one and only Alison Ballance, to talk about her latest book, all about this big blue bird.
Takahē, Bird of Dreams, has just come out. I'm very excited about it. It's a matching set with kakapo, rescued from the brink of extinction. So we have two incredible flightless giant birds, both of which we nearly lost and both of which we have dragged back from extinction. In fact, Takahē was declared extinct twice, and now it's doing just fine.
Where does the title come from?
Bird of Dreams was an expression from Dr. Geoffrey Orwell, who was the person who famously led the rediscovery team in November 1948, which refound the extinct Notornis, as it was known then, in the Murchison Mountains in Fiordland. And he had dreamed about this bird since he was 10 years old.
And because he had seen it at Otago Museum, right?
Yes, he'd seen a photo of a specimen, actually. His mum was a bit of a photographer. She had gone to Otago Museum. They had one of the 4 known specimens of Takahē mounted in the museum, and when he saw that picture and his mum explained to him about this extinct giant bird, he was both fascinated and appalled, and he was appalled at the idea of extinction, and he couldn't believe it was extinct, and so he became quite obsessed with it.
Is the book more science leaning? Is it more history? Is it really focused on the conservation? Tell me a bit about it.
It does a bit of everything. So I wanted to tell people about the bird itself, because the Takahē is a lovely bird. I think it's really dignified. So the bird itself is fascinating. The evolutionary story of how basically it was a pukeko-like bird that flew here and it got here and went, oh, I don't need to fly anymore, so I'll become a flightless giant and I'll just wander around eating tussock. And then the conservation story is fantastic, and the history is great as well. So in fact, it's those 3 things wrapped together.
And what was the most kind of challenging part for you?
The most challenging part for me was just that there was a huge amount of information there. So this year marks the 75th anniversary of the rediscovery. Well, that's 75 years of papers and records and reports and people doing stuff out in the field. So it was wrestling a lot of material and trying to go, what was the important stuff? What was the really interesting stuff? How can I put all this together in an interesting read?
And how long has it taken to put the book together? I mean, I guess that's a difficult question because you've been, working in this space and following the Takahē fortune for a very long time. But for the actual book itself?
On and off for probably 5 years. But I have not worked full-time on it in that time. But it was interesting for me going back because I have a very strong association with the kakapo recovery program as well. But actually I realised my association with Takahē went back further than that. So I first met a Takahē in the mid-1980s. And so that was halfway between the rediscovery and now. And you suddenly realise that actually that gives me quite a good perspective on the Takahē story.
What was that first encounter?
Well, the very first encounter was they had just successfully hand-reared the first birds in Te Anau, where they had got Takahē eggs out of the Murchison Mountains and had incubated them and hand-reared the chicks. And those chicks, alpine snow and tussock, were on display in the Te Anau Wildlife Park. And I was working in Fiordland National Park, and you could, probably the first time outside of Pukaha Mount Bruce, which was the other place where they had Takahē, you could wander down to the Te Anau Wildlife Park just like you still can today and see these incredible creatures. And then I got an opportunity to go into the Murchison Mountains and help on a survey. And so I got to see Takahē in the wild, which is an amazing experience.
Can you remember those first impressions? Can you remember that feeling or what you thought about the birds when you saw them?
The thing that amazed me in the Murchison Mountains was you have this bird that at first glance looks ridiculously bright. It's blue, it's got a huge red bill and a frontal plate, it's got massive red legs, and you go, this thing is really conspicuous, and then you put it in the tussock in Fiordland and you watch it disappear in front of your eyes as it just steps behind a tussock bush and it vanishes, and you go, how can something so conspicuous be so invisible? And then the other thing that struck me at the time was that huge thing of their dignity. Like, you sit and watch a pair of Takahē, and they're almost always in pairs because they like being in pairs. And they're very chatty and comfortable with each other, and they spend most of their time feeding, but they're just wandering along together, umphing. So if you sit and listen to Takahē, they're, how are you? Oh, I'm doing very well, thank you. This is a lovely piece of grass. How's your piece of grass? And they're oblivious to everything else around them. And you go, this is a bird that has been doing this for probably 2.5 million years. And I can sit and watch it, and that's incredible.
The title, Bird of Dreams, comes from Dr. Orbill, who was the person who went looking for them.
Well, he sort of led the effort. Dr. Orbill was an eye, ear, nose and throat doctor in Invercargill, but he had a crib up in Te Anau, and he had a big map on his wall of Fiordland, and he had marked every possible sighting of Takahē on this map for the previous 100 years, and he had realised that there was probably a place in the Murchison Mountains where if those birds were going to be found, that was where they were. And he went into the Murchison Mountains with some young friends. He had heard some tantalising sounds in the April of 1948, and so they went back looking for them.
And one of the people that was on that expedition with him was Joan Watson, and you spoke to Joan in the episode we're about to play from November 2018, and that episode was to mark the 70th anniversary of them being found in the Murchison Mountains.
That's the sound of several pairs of Takahē loudly reminding their neighbours that this is their territory. I'll come back to Burwood Bush and the 70th anniversary later on in the show, but first, let's go back in time to the rediscovery. Before humans arrived in New Zealand, there were two widespread species of Takahē, North Island and South Island. By the time of European settlement, the North Island species was extinct and the South Island species was very rare indeed. Between 1849 and 1898, just 4 notornis, as they were commonly called then, were seen. Over the next half-century, none. The problem? The usual mix of forest clearance and getting killed, especially by predators, feral cats, ferrets and especially stoats. Most people thought notornis were extinct, but Invercargill doctor Geoffrey Orbill wasn't so sure. He was a keen tramper and hunter and had an inkling that there might still be some surviving somewhere in Fiordland. In November 1948, Dr. Orbill headed into a hidden valley in Fiordland's Murchison Mountains. With him was young Joan Telfer, her husband-to-be Rex Watson, and Neil McCrosty. Joan died recently, but a couple of years ago she told me the story of their trips together and about rediscovering the Takahē.
I always went along. I never carried a gun. I was the girl without the gun, but I always seemed to go on expeditions and things like that. I was really privileged to have been. When I look back, I realise that, I was blessed having all this wonderful Fiordland, and with a man who was a leader. He was brilliant, well-read, and when you were out in the field with him, he knew so much about flora and fauna that, everything was a lesson to be learnt. It was tremendous, wonderful time.
So these were mostly little hunting trips you were going on?
Yes. I can remember the ones I enjoyed were he adapted an old car, and it was called the swamp buggy, and we would all pile on board and drive up along the Upakarora stream looking for a pig. Oh, I used to love that outing, but then there were so many more. Always something to do in that area. It's a fantastic place. It's just a paradise for people who like the outdoors.
And this was tramping mostly below the bushline, or did you go up above the bushline as well?
Well, I belonged to the Alpine Club for a while and climbed at Homer, so tramping and climbing.
And what kind of wildlife were you seeing when you were out in the hills in those days?
Birds, mainly, yes. Sometimes a deer, or more than that. I have seen 30 deer in a herd a way back, yes, moving from one area to another. And, of course, looking for Takahē, where Doc always said keep an eye out just in case, because it's a vast area and they could be anywhere.
So what did he used to say about the Takahē?
Well, he was more or less convinced that it was here somewhere, but he wasn't sure because there were so many stories, and he had listened to everybody who talked about the bird in the past. Even from when he was quite young, I understand, he showed an interest. And he suspected they were in the Murchison Mountains. Of course, we called it Natornis. Natornis.
So we're talking about the 1940s here.
1948, Easter was when they went in deer stalking. I didn't go for that trip. I don't know why, but probably I was into sport or something for that weekend. But my husband, Neil McCrosty, and Dr. Orbell went into the Murchison Mountains. They hadn't been in before, you see, so they're right up on the top.
Looking down. On this
yes,
hidden
and
lake,
notice
really.
this beautiful lake, which was called the Lake of the Friendless. The Maoris called it that. And the valley didn't have a name. Now the lake is Lake Orbell, and the valley is Takahē Valley.
But in those days it was the Lake of the Friendless.
Yes, yes. It's beautiful, beautiful lake. I saw deer, so they climbed down and shot one deer. My husband, Rex, he went down to the lake to have a drink and saw some footprints, and he called Doc over, and Doc always had a pipe, and with that he scratched the length of toes on this and got in touch with Dr. Fowler and Professor Sharples, and they all decided it was a white heron. So that was that, but not Doc. He had a feeling it was more than that. He'd heard an odd bird call while they were in there, something unusual, and thought that might it was inspecting or going in and investigating again.
Were they all quite excited when they came out?
Oh yes, quite excited. Or Doc was, but I think Neil and Rex, it was just another expedition, you know. They weren't so sure about everything. And it was very cold winter with snow well down, so there's no way that they could go in until it was the 19th of November. And I was invited along. We had netting, fishnet. I can't remember how many yards of fishnet to catch the birds. I would hope to catch the birds. But we left at 3:30 in the morning. You know, conditions on the lake were ideal. And the sun came up and everything was bright red. It was a gorgeous scene. It was brilliant. And we had breakfast on board. And we tied the boat up very near the entrance to the glowworm caves, and then climbed up and up and up through rock, windfalls, beautiful beech forest. It was a very difficult climb. It took about 3 hours. And we came out just by the stream at the outlet onto a flat area which was covered by boxwood and snowgrass. Snowgrass was deep. It was right up to our waists. It was huge. Wonderful cover for birds. And Doc said, follow me and don't talk, and only hand movements. So we walked only a very short distance through this snowgrass, and Doc crouched and put his finger up to say he could see one bird. So we were all crouching and peering, and through the snowgrass I caught a glimpse of the bright red beak. Then he put 2 fingers up, and there was a mate, a pair. So with that, he gave us orders quietly to put the netting in a semicircle around, and then quietly and very slowly. The birds weren't disturbed at all. We were so cautious, and we slowly drove them into the net. I looked down, there was the bird, and I thought, I'll have to do my thing. So I crouched down and grabbed it. I was almost throttling it, but I wasn't going to let it go. It was well trapped in the netting, and somebody came along and helped to release it.
So when you had that one in your hands,
Yes.
what were you thinking, apart from, I'm not going to let
This
this
is
one
it.
run away?
I was overwhelmed. We've got it. I couldn't believe it. And it's a beautiful bird. It's a brilliant bird. And so they were taken down to the beach. We had what we call lunch, but it was only 9:30. We couldn't believe our good fortune. We expected to be in the valley all day and not see a bird. And so we were overwhelmed. As I haven't got the Time magazine, but the Time magazine said we returned in ornithological ecstasy. I love that.
It was world news.
It was. And Doc knew that. Doc said that at the time. He said, now, as soon as we'd caught them and released them, he said, now we've got to get to Invercargill, to the paper, and spread the news. And it did. It just panicked from everywhere. People asked for articles and to talk to groups and so on. And it was a great time.
Because everyone had thought it was extinct.
Yes, they did. Yes.
And you'd rediscovered it.
Yeah.
Amazing.
It was. And it's National Geographic, you see, it was in all the magazines. The best magazines, the glossy magazines.
What struck you most about the bird when you first saw it?
Oh, the colour. The size and the colour. It would be like a rooster, about as standing, as tall as a rooster. But it had this magnificent beak, and then all the beautiful colouring down the back, and then a white tail. It was amazing. Spectacular in every way. Oh, you couldn't miss them in amongst the green grass, in amongst the tussock and so on.
What did Dr. Feller think?
Well, in January, Dr. Feller organised a party, and there were 10 of us. I was the only female.
Again?
But all the best of the men in... wasn't the Department of Conservation, I think it was Internal Affairs in those days, with Dr. Orbell. And we were in there for a week, living in tents and exploring. And we actually saw 50 birds, but Dr. Fowler thought there would be 100. Thought there must be, because we spread out and we walked the valley up and down, and we were counting and doing. That was another enjoyable occasion.
And did you ever go into the Murchisons again after that?
Yes, I've been in by helicopter on 2 occasions. The 50th, Neil McCrosty, Rex Watson, Joan Watson and Dr. Orbell. Yes, we went in by helicopter.
Was it nice to go back?
Oh, great. And then later, I can't remember the occasion, I think the family all decided we should go in.
That was Joan Watson, recalling the time she, her husband Rex Watson and Neil McCrosty and Geoffrey Orbell rediscovered the Takahē 70 years ago this week. None of the original rediscovery party are still alive, but Doc decided to celebrate instead with some of their children, and that's what we're off to do now. The plan for the day is to fly into the Murchison Mountains to release a pair of Takahē, and the families will get a chance to visit the famous Takahē Valley. Back at Burwood Bush, Ranger Glenn Greaves is catching 2 young Takahē and putting them carefully into travel boxes.
So we've got a male called Dore, D-O-R-E, who's named after a famous explorer, and the second bird, the female, is called Tauhō. One was reared at Burwood Takahē Centre, the other one came from an island in Fovo Strait, and they've been paired together for the last couple of months in a pen.
Among the family members watching are Rex and Joan Watson's children.
So I'm Huntley Watson. I'm the oldest of Joan and Rex Watson's family.
I'm Paula Potu, nee Watson, and I'm the youngest.
So what do you all reckon when you get a chance to stand here and look at Takahē like that?
Yeah. This is a very emotional time.
So it's the ending of my parents' era with the Takahē, but the beginning of the children and grandchildren, I think.
Have you been into Takahē Valley before?
Never know, it's closed, so I haven't had the opportunity.
Never. And so that's even more exciting to see where they actually stood and where they actually found them.
Before we leave Burwood Bush, it has a very interesting history. These days, dock staff fondly refer to it as their Takahē farm. 25 pairs of birds are housed in large, predator-free outdoor pens full of their favourite food, tussock, and pretty much left to their own devices to breed and hopefully produce lots of new Takahē. Burwood Bush was set up in the mid-1980s. At the time, there was only a small and steadily declining population of wild Takahē. They were found only in Fiordland's Murchison Mountains, and there was just 100 or so birds, down from an estimated population of 200 to 400 when Doc Orbell and the team rediscovered them. For about 25 years, Burwood Bush was home to an intensive captive rearing effort to raise chicks from surplus eggs collected in the wild in Fiordland. They could do this because Takahē lay 2 eggs, but almost only ever raise 1 chick. The chicks were reared using puppets to ensure they didn't imprint on people, and over 25 years, more than 300 Takahē were released. They went either to safe new island homes all around the country or back into Fiordland to boost the wild population. But it turned out there was a problem. The hand-reared birds successfully adapted to life in the wild and survived well, but they weren't nearly as good as wild birds at being parents and raising chicks. The puppet rearing was stopped, and the Takahē farm idea successfully kicked off. Each year now there are about 25 birds to find homes for, and Dor and Toho are in a helicopter en route to Tor's Ridge, just over the lake from Te Anau. As the chopper lands, we can hear the birds in their travel boxes calling. It seems they can't wait to be let free in their new home. Do you want to describe this amazing landscape, Glenn?
Yeah, it's a beautiful place here, quite special. We've got a ridge of limestone outcrops here, sort of spurs of rock jutting out into the sky. It's incredible, especially on a day like this where you can see the lake in the background in the township of Te Anau. So this territory has historically always held at least 1 pair of Takahē, but it's currently empty, so it's a perfect place to release these birds.
Well, they've got a nice home to go to, these birds.
Okay, so undo the latches. Who knows how they'll react when they come out of the box. Some of them just take off, other ones will come out quite slowly. Okay, on 3. 1, 2, 3.
Oh, babies.
Wow, they're beautiful looking birds.
Oh, look, we've got a great big area.
Whole futures before you.
They're looking quite calm, aren't they?
Oh, I think so. I think they look very settled and beautiful day. So they should be happy.
Oh,
It looks like a new playground.
wow.
Look at that, eh? Away they go.
Have fun.
And lovely to see the birds running that miles away.
I think they're out of sight now.
Yeah, they're out of sight, that's right.
They'll have a good look around, see if there are any other birds here. Once we leave, they'll start calling and trying to find their territory again.
While Dor and Toho explore and settle into their new home, we hop over the hill to Takahē Valley, where I get a chance to catch up with Geoffrey Orbell's daughters and hear their recollections of the rediscovery.
Hi, I'm Linley Charteris now, Doc Orbell's oldest daughter.
I'm my Linley's sister, second one in line.
The day it happened, I must have been 8 or 9. And I can remember Father had a boat called the Mariner and it was varnished. And this varnish boat went round and round in circles.
I remember the boat.
Yes, going round and round outside the boat harbour.
So he was doing celebratory laps.
He did, well, yes, he did. And he came in, and the furore afterwards, internationally, was absolutely incredible. There was just telegrams, because that's the day of the telegrams, and there were people interviewing people, and, it was just went on and on and on. It was quite spectacular, really. And that's why my mother, many years hence, when there was still a hoo-ha and she was in her 90s, kept saying, I'm sick of that damn bird. But she was only joking about it.
And you've been into Takahē Valley before, haven't you?
Yes, I came in I would be late teens or very early 20s. Flew in and then walked out. So we stayed a night or so in the hut, which I'm sure is still the same.
I came in once with father and mother, and it was the first time she came in with Joan and Rex. And it's been a privilege to have our grandchildren and our children walk up here and thoroughly enjoy it as well. I think that's quite special.
Doc's Glenn Greaves manages a team of rangers looking after Takahē, which are now spread across the Murchison Mountains and 19 other sites around the country, including Goulin Downs on the popular Hifi track in Kahurangi National Park. Let's catch up with him to find out a bit more about how the population is doing overall, especially how many Takahē there are now.
So we've got a pretty close estimate of around 376, so somewhere between 370 and 380 we think. So it's up about 10% from last year's population, which is a really good year.
Now tell me about that Kahurangi release. Why have you moved birds up to Northwest Nelson?
So we've got a good problem where we've got too many birds at our current sites. So we're really looking forward to create new sites, and rather than small offshore islands, we're really looking for large mainland sites now. And that's what Kahurangi really provides. Goulin Downs is a large site, about 3,500 hectares of tussock and nearly predator-free, so it's a perfect site for Takahē, we think.
How many birds did you release there?
So we've released 30. They've been there now 6 months, and all are still alive, and pretty much all within the downs themselves. They've stayed put, which is a really great sign. And last week we found the first nest.
So how many eggs in this first nest?
So that nest had 3 eggs, which is
a bit odd for Takahē.
Yeah. So this is actually a trio. So we've got an excess of females at that site. There are more females than males, and so what's happened is we've got a couple of pairs that have an additional female adult with them. So yeah, we may actually have 4 eggs by the time we go back and have another look.
So any idea whether those eggs might be fertile?
No, they were too young to determine for sure. I think the eldest egg was around 4 days, but we'll know for certain in a couple of weeks when we do another field trip up there.
Now, thinking about stoats, because they're the main predator, what have stoat numbers been like in the Murchison Mountains?
So they've dropped back to probably the lowest level that's ever been there since we've been monitoring them, but they did peak over last summer and early autumn. We did lose a few adult Takahē to stoat predation, unfortunately.
And what's this coming year looking like?
We're expecting a big rat plague. The beech trees are flowering really heavily at the moment, so unfortunately that means next summer we'll have high rat numbers, which will lead on to high stoat numbers the following year. On the good side, we've got quite intensive trapping control, predator control in the Murchison Mountains now.
Now today we released 2 birds, and how many more birds are you going to release into the Murchison Mountains this year?
So we've got another 18 birds to be released next week, Wednesday, weather dependent. So that'll boost the population to around the 150 mark, which is fairly close to carrying capacity.
So that was the situation in late 2018. As Glenn said, an estimated 370 to 380 birds, and a Takahē release earlier that year into a new site at Kahurangi National Park, but also an impending beach mass season where there'll be more predators, and that problem of having too many birds and not the space to put them in. November of this year will be the 75th anniversary. So what's happened in the 5 years since?
They've made lots more Takahē, and most of those birds have actually gone back into the Murchison Mountains because they had a series of years where that population was dropping down. So they filled it to the max. They boosted that population as much as they can. The Kahurangi birds, the jury's a bit out on whether the Hifi track Goulin Downs area is a good place for Takahē. So there were a couple of chicks produced in the first year. Then, if people remember, we had a mega mast
a really big beach masting season. They lost 2 or 3 Takahē to predators. They had an unfortunate incident around the 1080 drop where birds wandered out of the exclusion zone and ate 1080 pellets and died. And then birds just started dying. They seemed very underweight. They don't seem to be thriving. There were no more successful nests. There was a flood which took out a number of nests. So that 30 birds that they'd put into Kaharangi got down to 15. They've topped that up again. They have just had a successful breeding season again. They have a couple of chicks produced, but the jury's out. So they don't know whether long term, whether they will leave the birds there. But at the moment, they still don't have another place to move them to. They need big predator-free areas, basically.
That's what I was just about to ask. What is Takahē country? So obviously tussock, because that's what they eat, but they also need a large area and very little stoats. Is it stoats in particular, or is it all predators?
Well, in the Murchison Mountains, it's stoats that are the big problem. They are looking at areas such as the Greenstone Valley at the head of Lake Wakatipu, the Reese Valley as well. There are cats and ferrets there, so they're trying to get those numbers right down because they imagine that those will be a problem as well. And they don't just need tussock. Tussock is good, but you need good tussock. So Kaharangi is red tussock. It's probably just not quite good enough. Pasture grass is fine. So a mixture of tussock and grass, like in the Greenstone Valley, would probably be really good for them.
And numbers-wise, what are they up to now?
Well, at the moment, the population officially stands at 475, and Takahē are a bit like racehorses, so they have one birthday a year. They don't count them until the first winter's passed. So on the 1st of October this year, the population will pass 500. I don't know exactly what it will be. Doc doesn't know exactly what it will be yet, but it will reach 500. Now, that's amazing.
Yeah, that does sound pretty special, but again, I guess it's going to impound their problem of where to put them.
Predator-free New Zealand, bring it on.
And so, future for Takahē, I mean, are there any challenges that they might come up against that, say, the kakapo have faced, like genetic bottlenecks or diseases? Or does it seem to be that they're actually doing pretty good?
They're actually doing really well on that front. Their genetics seem to be in pretty good shape. Glenn Greaves keeps a close eye on that. They haven't been through a bottleneck the way kakapo and black robin have, which is surprising, but there's some good genetic diversity out there. It would be good to find out whether there's still some extra diversity in the Murchison Mountain birds that they haven't got represented in the captive population that they know of. So they have a big pedigree that they work on. They've done genomic work. They haven't had any major disease issues. With climate change, you never know what's going to happen on that front in terms of any of our species. When you think of hoiho, yellow-eyed penguin in Dunedin, which is the population is crashing at the moment. So nothing is off the table, but there's no big red flags at the moment.
Well, that's good news and plenty of birds. So I guess the future is all about finding different places to put them. And hopefully, they'll keep expanding. We'll have more Takahē, more experiences like you had, where you can go into the mountains and see them. That would be amazing.
It would be lovely to have more wild opportunities for people. At the moment, there are plenty of opportunities. You can go to Tiritiri Mātangi in Auckland, you can go to Orokonui in Dunedin, and that's amazing. But it would be nice for people to be able to go tramping in the mountains and just come across a Takahē that is a wild bird, and you could have your own all-bell moment.
A massive thanks to Alison Ballance for taking the time to come chat with me. This episode, which originally aired on the 22nd of November 2018, was produced by Alison Ballance. She spoke to Doc Takahē Ranger Glenn Greaves, the late Joan Watson, and members of the families of Jeffrey Orbell and Joan and Rex Watson. Sound engineering was by Phil Benj, and Tim Watkin is executive producer of podcasts and series at RNZ. Kia whaia I te au hurihanga I te tahi taupanga pai ake kia koe. Follow Our Changing World on your favourite podcast app. Plus, we're now on YouTube. Search for the RNZ podcast channel where you can find the Our Changing World playlist. Our website is at rnz.co.nz/ourchangingworld, and it's there that you can access the absolute treasure trove that is the Our Changing World back catalogue of episodes. You can also sign up to our monthly newsletter there, or you can keep up to date with us on Twitter or Facebook, where we are at RNZ Science. Tēnā koe I whakarongo mai. Thanks so much for listening. Have a great week. Kia pai tō wiki.